So welcome back. We are getting towards the end, just on the other side of the midway point of the third part of the course, which is on controlling. Creating, connecting, now controlling. And what do we do? How do we control the creations and connections that are intrinsic to the video game world? So you'll remember at the beginning of the class, the beginning of the course, I expressed the intention of not talking about Sandy Hook in a video game context until much more towards the end of the course. And the reason for that is that we're all human, and in the heat of the moment and in the heat of our emotions and reactions, it's hard to take a clear look at anything. And I, by no means, am representing that today will be a clear look, but hopefully with the passage of time it will be a clearer look than it otherwise would have been. My thesis for the day is, certainly when it comes to violence in video games and other societal issues in video games, there's a fair bit of law. A lot of it's in the book, and a lot of it is in the slides. But you have to ask yourself whether in the world that we're now in, all of that law needs to be rethought. And I just take you back to a version of the slide from last week, which is, where is gaming going? This has been a theme of the course, and our discussion of Ingress and Google Glass and marrying them in the notion that instead of video gaming being a pixelated version of real world themes and memes coming into your television set or into your computer, gameplay is now increasingly going out into the real world, and that changes everything. So when we look at Sandy Hook, when we look at Columbine, when we look at the influence of video games, we are naive and wrong-headed, in my view, to not consider where things really are. And I can see Ken is in complete shock because this is so different than things I've said before. Don't worry. I'm still a freedom of expression guy. So let's connect just a little bit more before we move forward. This is a remix of a slide from last week where I, for most of last week's talk, took you through the various layers of control as I saw them, and this needs to be refined significantly but the layers start from the place closest to the game, which you'll see delineated as in the game, and move outside the game. And I noticed something that I didn't mention last week. So in the game, we had a big discussion of the magic circle last week and a whole series of legal articles about the implications of the magic circle in law. Would also note something, just as a thesis, that demarcation point between in the game and out of the game also seems to be a demarcation point as to whether you look at something from a more kind of personal ethic perspective or a societal norms perspective. There's nothing earth-shaking about that observation. It just may help situate. Today, we're really focusing on 6, 7, and 8. And what can be done, what should be done from a self-regulation standpoint, from a normative, governmental, regulatory, or statutory perspective. And although it's a very strange name for it, in this context, consumer protection issues. Psychological harm, harmful products, and are video games a harmful product? And again, in the context of the future video game, well, which is, in fact, the present video game, or at least early iterations are present today, because that is the tougher problem. So we may as well solve the tougher problem than the easier one, if this is where we're going. So before we get there, I don't know, I've been watching too much reality television. Secrets of contractual immunity. So we've alluded to it. You guys have asked questions about it. But let's put it right on the table. A huge proportion of gamers are underage. They're children, they're kids. And end user license agreements in terms of service being contractual don't obviously apply to them. And the evidence, though anecdotal, is when you look at the mod cases. And you look at the BNetD case, for example. You'll see who the defendants Blizzard sued are. And you will see that there was a whole large group of community members. And it is very unlikely that those members of the community did not include underage kids hacking away at multiplayer for StarCraft. I'd venture to say it's impossible, but we need to be cautious. We're in a law school. So let's just say it's highly unlikely. So there's some data that I dug out, and it comes out in two parts that are important to this discussion. So the first part basically says 32% of gamers are kids. And the second part says that 91% of kids are gamers. So within that 32% of the overall population, and think about it, you're, as I know, you're an adult a lot longer than you're a kid. Being a kid is fleeting. So 32% is a pretty big number. And interestingly, those kids are responsible for 44% of software sales. So it's in terms of games. So they buy above their weight. They punch above their weight in terms of impact. But of that 32%, 91% of kids are gamers. Oddly, that strikes me as a little low, but and because these figures are dated and because smartphones are still growing in impact, and because I didn't look deeply into the methodology here, it's hard to know, but there you go. Now let's get into the touchy part of this, because this is the part, even when we put ourselves in the shoes of the legal departments of video game companies, it's impossible to know, in my view, what they're really thinking. So all we've got are some facts. And the fact that does deserve to be called out, though fairly, is that, as we know, end user license agreements and terms of service talk about a lot of things. And I've earlier argued that almost everything but the kitchen sink is in there, and sometimes that's in there too. But generally speaking, you will not find anything at all dealing with the underage issue. So you can treat that as, well, but why would you? You know it doesn't, the contract doesn't apply, so don't mention it. Why would you, as a responsible lawyer and a responsible drafter, include irrelevant provisions? Or you can take the continuum anywhere to, well, we don't really want to draw attention to the fact that kids shouldn't be playing these games or not playing them in these ways. So you decide where that goes, but intellectually honest, with any sense of intellectual honesty, you have to at least wonder that an issue that looms so large is not, I'm not saying this has to look like a cigarette carton, but that it's generally not mentioned at all, deserves some focus. And then the flip side of that, for those of you who are, and many of you are, major defenders of the end user license agreement and TOS contractual regime, I'm poking you a little bit, because it does go a little bit to how ineffectual those contracts really are. Okay, that was an easy one. Now we get to an ethical and moral issue that is all over the map and that has played out in the wake of Sandy Hook. And I noticed it right away. And it was one of those things that takes time to figure out how best to extrapolate on it without being unfair. So if anybody downloaded the press conference of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, after Sandy Hook, and the transcript is available on their website, you will have seen Wayne LaPierre talk about and attack the video game industry as a callous, corrupt, and corrupting shadow. And let's hold everyone's sense of irony for a moment, because I will get there. And hopefully do that issue justice. But there's a parsing and a layering that's more interesting here, at least for the moment. And that is the games that the NRA called out. Because the NRA called out some very specific games. Bulletstorm, Grand Theft Auto, Mortal Kombat, Splatterhouse, and a old Flash game, 10 years old, terrible game that I don't think anybody, except for the NRA, I don't know that anyone really noticed, but with a title that obviously would get noticed in the way of after Sandy Hook, game with the horrible name Kindergarten Killers. Remember watching this and going, well, that's a really interesting choice of games. Because there are very realistic hunt and kill and shoot games with real weapons in them that are not mentioned. These are different, these are sci-fi games. Grand Theft Auto is notoriously a crime game where you get to play the bad guy in many ways. Mortal Kombat is a pure fantasy violence game. Splatterhouse is a horror game. So what's left off the list? Only probably the most popular, some of the most popular games. Halo was also left off the list, but let's assume that to be benign for now. Call of Duty, Battlefield, and a game called America's Army. And of course, the interesting thing about America's Army, if you don't know, is that it is a game developed and put online for free, and it's an excellent game in the sense of quality of game, by the US military for recruiting purposes. So really interesting that that genre, which is the most realistic hunt and shoot and kill genre, and the genre of game where if you were intentionally trying to practice, and I'm not suggesting anybody does or would, but if you had malice of forethought and were going to go on a shooting spree and really wanted to do damage, those would be the games you would be training with, not Mortal Kombat.
I'm curious to know if you've come across whether the America's Army game has actually been successful either in having a lot of people play it or having people actually admitting that this is one of the reasons they were a little more interested in signing for the Army, because that'd be a very interesting piece of information.
I think there's a wonderful bit of research there. I don't fully know the answer, so I can only give you, I'll give you two answers. One is anecdotal and one is the fact. The anecdotal piece is that when America's Army was first introduced, there was a huge wave of publicity, and it was a very popular game. And in fact, it technologically, maybe this shouldn't be a surprise, was very advanced. And I'm not sure it advanced gameplay or multiplayer, but it was very, very close to the cutting edge. So it was it was really out there, and a lot of gamers played it, and I'm not at all a first-person shooter guy, and I downloaded it and did some of it. It seems to have faded from the gaming press landscape. And I don't know if that's just a reaction to an ethical issue, but you don't really see America's Army being covered, at least in terms of, over the last couple of years, in terms of what I follow. Having said that, for this, I went back to see where it was. It's on its third iteration. It's now it's now using airplanes. It's introduced new weapons, and my assumption, which is only an assumption, is that they wouldn't be on AA3 and still pouring money into it if it wasn't desirable. Now, with sequestration and all those issues in the States, we'll see if it gets cut or not.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that I just popped on the site that has game sales on it, and the recent version that's free, obviously we don't know how many copies they moved, but the one next gen version that they actually put on sale only sold like 80,000 copies worldwide. So
that's not a lot.
No.
But it is a free download on the PC, so that's where most of their audience was. Now, whether it's, I guess the interesting question, which I certainly don't know the answer to, is whether it is a recruiting and training tool in any kind of real way. I'm trying to remember the name of a movie, but there was this movie that I quite liked. It was a science fiction movie, and a very cheesy science fiction movie. And the premise was that this alien galactic civilization that was fighting for its freedom had come to Earth and gone to other planets and installed the last Starfighter, thank you very much, had installed arcade games in various restaurants and were using it as a tool to figure out who had the best reflexes and who could be recruited as a starfighter to fight for freedom. These were the good guys. And of course, our hero was an ace at this game, got recruited, and became the hero of the film. So if you like that kind of kitschy fare, and I do, look it up. Certainly one of my favorite movies of the genre. So don't know that America's Army is being used in that way, but don't know it isn't being used in that way. And certainly, as technology advances and we look at gaming of the future, from the previous slide, you could see some really fascinating scenarios where you could really measure people's ability and acuity and reflexes. And in a world of big data, it's fascinating. Sports teams put a lot of money into training sessions with full-on measurement. Well, we're getting to the point where anybody can be measured that way. And you could be using it for recruiting in all sorts of ways. So we'll leave it at that, but really want to very quickly just note a couple of articles. Really interesting piece from Eurogamer. How video game fund arms manufacturers. So this is about the licensing of the virtual weapons from the gun manufacturers, which of course are the constituency of the NRA. So draw your own conclusions as to why that might be, whether that might be a contributing factor as to why they weren't mentioned as part of the callous, corrupt, and corrupting shadow. And then, of course, EA removes link to gun sellers on Medal of Honor page. That happened right after Sandy Hook and right after this issue. It's terrible. I don't want to say blew up. This issue manifested. And then if you want to go sort of academic and certainly anti-American, there is an academic piece about these kinds of games and militarism writ large and the social implications of the Call of Duty, Battlefield, America's Army type of game.
The NRA's choice in the games there seems to be a propaganda tactic. The names sound pretty brutal for any non-gamer to hear them, whereas Call of Duty, Battlefield, America's Army, they sound more patriotic. And the NRA doesn't want to be on the other side of that.
And the explanation may be that simple and that innocent. Yeah, and Grand Theft Auto is ambiguous on that score. So, hard question of industry complicity, first part. Different kind of industry complicity issue. And you will remember, hard to forget, the Grand Theft Auto San Andreas hot coffee mod explosion of a number of years ago. And just to very quickly bring you into the picture, if you don't know about it or remember it, when Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was made, a number of scenes were included in the game that were, for a video game, for the time, explicitly sexual and abusive of women. And involved one of the bad guy characters sort of having sex on demand. It was not a rape scene as characterized, but the material was very explicitly sexual, very explicit. When it came time to release the game, it was decided somehow not to include this material. And rather than the material being removed from the disc, it was hid on the disc. And here, by that hangs the tape. And again, nobody really knows for sure. It is fair to assume that anybody on the development side knows that there is a mod community and a hacker community out there. This turned out not to be a very difficult thing to hack the code of, and a modder within days, if not hours, of the release of San Andreas, released to the world a patch that unlocked the previously locked explicit material. This caused a great furor, and both politically and otherwise. And I've chronicled for you, with the benefit of hindsight, some of the better articles. The starting point really should be the GameSpot, I'm sorry, I didn't include it. I will post it tonight. But the key, oh, I'm sorry. It's on the next page. The key article is Who Spilled Hot Coffee? The Man Who Uncovered Gaming's Greatest Sex Scandal. And that was written this year, and it's a retrospective of what happened. So do start there. But included the FTC complaint against Take-Two and just a bunch of source material. The key issue manifested itself in the ratings board coming down really hard and changing its own rules, because the ESRB's rules needed perhaps to be clearer on what was included in the disc to get the rating. And the argument, fair or not, was that all of the material on the disc had to be disclosed, not just that was intended for the consumer. And if all the material had been disclosed, a different decision on rating would have been made. And in fact, the ESRB changed the rating after the game had been released, and that would have resulted, and did result, in a recall of the game. So it was a giant mess. And the article that again from Eurogamer, Who Spilled Hot Coffee, tells the story of the person who was the modder who released it. And you will see that there's a pretty good argument that Rockstar threw him in, blamed the modding community, and whether that was appropriate or not. The issue that I want to highlight, and you can fairly say, well, John, you're a broadcaster, you come from a sort of more mature industry originally. There is an industry maturity issue, and certainly at that time there was. And it's impossible to know, but not impossible to wonder whether some people in the development chain just thought it would be cool to have this content in there, knowing that it would be released and released by the mod community. And certainly that's the implication of how the matter was handled, but there's never been a confession, and it's not really for me to allege it or not. But it is a possibility. Whether you only want to go so far as to say there's an industry maturity issue, because somebody should have recognized that if that material wasn't going to be released and was not intended for the public, it's not that hard to wipe it off the disk and make sure the disk doesn't go out.
Yeah, I think it needs to be contextualized, though. This is a period of time when there was considerable debate between the John Perry Barlow people who were arguing in favor of cyberspace being a place that shouldn't have to be worrying about censorship of content and things like that, as opposed to an industry feeling the heat because of the linkage to influencing children and things like that about potential censorship, and trying to implement a rating system that was to forestall having a government impose sensorial sorts of design. I think there was a lot of disagreement in the community, especially amongst the developers, as to whether or not they should roll over on this or not. And I think it was, seems to me anyway, a fairly clear attempt to show the downside of requiring, of the manipulation of your text. We see the same thing in movies with director's cuts versus, films that have been cut so as to get a particular rating for its marketing purposes and things like that as well. Same sort of ethic, I think.
I agree with, well, first of all, I totally agree with what the tenor of the time was and what the debate was, and the freedom within the magic circle issue as opposed to government censorship, and that tension. Having said that, my worst fear, and I apologize for it, is that this was a couple of men, loosely speaking, in their 20s, saying, well, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? I'm not saying that's what happened, but that is my worst fear. Yes, it might have been an intentional, thoughtful declaration of freedom. And if it was, maybe I prefer the Aaron Schwartz way, downloading endless free academic journals, to something that involved such a negative portrayal of sexuality in women. So it's an odd choice for that degree, for a statement of principle. But yes, it might have been a thoughtful statement of principle. If it was, and that's my only pushback on this, if it was, I would think that by 2013, somebody would have declared that and said, this went terribly wrong, but this is what we intended. So the one part of this that sort of an underlying theme, when something like this goes wrong, there will always be a group in any company that will move towards saying this should not have happened, so this is why we need to create corporate layers. We need more lawyers, we need more accountants, we need to really ride herd on the creatives to make sure things like this don't happen. So there are parts of this kind of thing that that do create further problems. I mentioned this already, and I'll just mention it very briefly again. EULAs in terms of service in this context generally do not even mention underage use. So now, given where we are in this talk, think about that and what the motives are and what the simplest explanation, as Ptolemy would have wanted us to find, actually is.
To go back to that just for a second, one of the things, how much do we require the alcohol industry to address underage drinking?
And the cigarette industry.
Well, the cigarette industry, we've actually gone someplace. As you say, they now have cigarette cartons and things that are there. But when it comes to underage use of alcohol, which everyone agrees is rampant, if not ubiquitous, there's very little that is required of the distillers or the brewers. If anything, the brewers are quite able to show very young people who might or might not be of legal drinking age enjoying themselves with lifestyle ads and a variety of things like that.
And it may well be that if there was a tax on violent video games, there might be more looking the other way. To your point directly. Don't know. But your point is totally well taken. All right. So there are a whole lot of cases, some of which you've heard about in other talks. And I don't want to pretend this is a definitive list. All of the cases are accessible in the course materials that are online, in the book, and online generally. You won't have any problem. The big one, the notorious one, of course, is the Schwarzenegger, and the most recent one, and Supreme Court of the United States case, is the Schwarzenegger case. Just want you to have the list, and the demarcation has to do with civil actions for liability and legislative constraints are below the line. And these are all American cases. I'll get to the Canadian ones and the Canadian differences shortly. But they all bring in freedom of expression, free speech, First Amendment, what we think of as charter principles. Now this is a gigantic distillation, and therefore academically wanting. But if you accept the notion that we're moving into a more challenging world and we need to start coming to some conclusions about that, and that the cases of the past only take us so far, maybe this is adequate for our purposes today, not for general academic purposes. So in the above the line civil cases, if you distill all of the jurisprudence, the American jurisprudence down, you get to, look, this wasn't foreseeable. That this game would cause this kid to commit suicide, murder other kids, commit a crime. It's not foreseeable. There isn't proximate cause. And generally, liability as a result of the product of video games is restricted to me throwing a razor-sharp disc at you and you getting injured physically by the fact that the disc has taken out your eye, not to the content on the disc. And in the present context, the civil liability test on developers and distributors of video games is the duty to exercise ordinary care. So there's your distillation. When you get into statutory, mostly state attempts at curtailing the distribution of video games to minors, or the Washington State one, which is curtailing the distribution of video games in which officers of the law could be hurt in the context of the video game by the player. You get to similar reasoning, causality not demonstrated, correlation not cause. And then there's in some of the cases, you will find a particular political ethos which you will recognize, which is that censorship is a form of thought control which will bring a nation ultimately to become a totalitarian state, and that the bastion of all that is good and proper and protective is the family, and therefore these issues need not be state issues, but family issues to be determined within the family and by parents. And whatever your political stripe, there are elements of truth across all of this. And this is for you to decide, and for us in the law school as best we can to map the territory. Then we get to the more legal stuff, the next 2 points. A lot of the cases criticize the drafting not being narrowly tailored enough. We see this a lot in Canadian constitutional jurisprudence, vague and ambiguous definitions. You know, what is a violent video game? You know, when a statute says that, how is it defined? Is it defined adequately? These are difficult things, and the courts often seize on those definitional conundrums and say, can't do it. And these are, again, the American courts. And there's one that really resonates, especially as you get to the higher courts and you get to the more erudite judges, and that is, well, how are we going to judge violent video games a certain way and not apply the same standard to classic literature, to the Bible, to fairy tales? Does this mean that we should ban Grimm's fairy tales? Because it can be equally horrendous, and it's certainly of the same genre. And yes, you absolutely can push back. Well, it's not interactive, and you know. So the debate kind of locates itself that way. In Canada, the direction of our jurisprudence, and there's not much of it, and there's only one case directly related to video games, which happened involving an arcade that I used to frequent when I was at McGill Law School, my favorite arcade on St. Catherine Street. So this case means a lot to me. For a Supreme Court of Canada case, it's fairly narrowly tailored because it deals with a civil bylaw. And that restricts entry to arcades to children, to adults over 18, and the Supreme Court of Canada in no way suggested that there wasn't legislative authority for this to happen. They just said the city didn't have the right to do it. So it only takes you so far. And then when you look at the other cases that you could apply by analogy, Irwin Toy and Sharp, what stands out about these cases is that as opposed to the US constitutional doctrine that requires causality, requires that it be demonstrated that violent video games cause violence, the Canadian standard would appear to be much lower. But we don't have a test case. So if you want to argue that the standard is the same as it would be elsewhere, you would have to somehow distinguish Irwin Toy, which is a ban on commercial advertising directed at children under 13, and there was no evidence or even discussion of whether direct harm had to be proven. And Sharp, 2001 Supreme Court case, which in dealing with child pornography and the constitutionality of a provision banning it, found that a reasoned apprehension of harm to children is sufficient. So not full-on test of causality through academic studies. Okay. We now move to the political issue. And this really does, in the United States, line up to what people believe, which is that games contribute to violence, and what appears to be more factual. And there's a bunch of articles and some very persuasive ones that seem to come from people who know what they're talking about, who argue, no, what's really going on here is that people select and self-select. If you have violent tendencies, you will enjoy violent video games. It's not that the violent video games make you violent. So this was fun to do. And I'm not going to be able to spend a whole lot of time on it. But what I did on the left side was put down censorious memes from a cultural standpoint. You know, there was a call to ban All in the Family. Various things, the Satanic Verses, the banning of Madonna's Like a Prayer, Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show, where they cut him off below the waist. And I mapped it to Supreme Court of Canada cases. And they're ambiguous, so it's not a direct comparison. The question to ask yourself is whether we are, as I would suggest, moving on a trajectory of openness. And that openness is not uncontradicted by any means, but the Bragg case, for example, which was anonymity for a bullied complainant, you can understand that case as a user's rights privacy case. So I think that generally the world has become more open, and I did sort of one more thing, and I'm not even going to spend any time on it, is just giving you some sense of where the Supreme Court of Canada now is on user rights. We're going to talk a whole lot more about this 2 weeks from now, so I'm not going to spend any time on it, but this is just a preview of slides later. But, sorry. The one thing I'll talk about again in a minute, but is as you follow the censorious memes on the left-hand side, to look back at the top of the list and realize that to some extent you're saying, gee, that was silly. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that silliness. I just want to put a good word for the second law of thermodynamics, which basically says it's the one physical law that supports the notion of the arrow of time. You will not find another physical law that supports the arrow of time. And what it essentially says is that a system moves to increasing complexity, even chaos. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, that's a natural thing. So now, let's focus directly on violence and gaming, start with the painful truth. This is wonderfully written. This is the Dungeons and Dragons case, Waters and TSR, which I treat as a video game case, even though technically it's not. And the judge talking about Johnny Burnett, who committed suicide, and his mom sued the makers of Dungeons and Dragons. His death surely was not the fault of his mother, or his school, or his friends, or the manufacturer of the game he and his friends so loved to play. Tragedies such as this simply defy rational explanation, and courts should not pretend otherwise. So now, in the next 5 minutes, here's the case I'm going to make. People want, and it's understandable, in the wake of a Sandy Hook, in the wake of a Columbine, it is understandable that we want simple and clear and absolute answers. And the case I'm going to make is for some absolutes, but not the ones you expect. So, let me just tell you what this slide was really about. So this slide is really about the fact that we talk about censorship, and that there's a dialectic between artists, creators, the courts, and society. And that we move forward in that discussion and debate. And the parallel, and this is well known, and you'll see it in articles that are cited here and cited elsewhere on the blog. There has been a decrease in violence and crime. And some would argue that that decrease actually parallels the increase in video gaming and entertainment. And again, when you're dealing with correlation, not cause, those arguments are easy to make. I'm going to argue, since correlation is an easy standard, that it feels more true to me, even than that, to suggest that the more we debate censorship and freedom, the more we debate where the lines should be, the more conscious we are that that leads in some way, over time, over eons, to a decrease in violence and crime. And the best parallel support I can find is Steven Pinker's brilliant book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And you can't distill a book of several hundred pages, but parsing it through, there's really a core argument that our ability to reason allows us to curtail the appeal and appeals of violence. And that reason, that ability to reason, comes from this process, comes from education, comes from thinking about things, about defining our own lines, comes from the power of the dialectic. The second absolute that I will suggest to you is that it is, in ethical and philosophical terms, absolutely bad to address problems and issues in their extreme cases. You will have learned by now that hard cases make bad law. And that's just a version of this. So if you are trying to create And think about this. Think about this as a member of a civil society. Think about this as a potential legislator, a potential judge, and the lawyers you're all going to be. If you are trying to craft laws and policies to prevent Sandy Hook, to prevent Columbine, what are those going to look like? And there is, I grant you, a difference between prevention and addressing. But it will result in an odd and inappropriate and perhaps more totalitarian middle. And most of us and most of society lives in the middle. So if you're dealing with it just at the extremes, you're going to have issues. And you're also going to have to deal with the actual data. And it's not for me to put out a theory on this, but if you look at the studies about games decreasing violence, you sort of, I come to this sense that what happens is that we all self-select. I self-selected to law for a reason. You guys probably did too. We all self-select. And it would not be shocking that people who have violent issues would be drawn to violent video games. And it's also not wrong in science to understand the prophylactic effect that could actually decrease real violence in the real world. It can also reinforce it in some ways too. These are not simple issues. But my argument is that it's absolutely wrong to address these issues at their extremes. And then the third one I mentioned is that we laugh or smile or chuckle at previous attempts to censor. And in the current environment, how do you read Chief Justice Dixon and Town Cinema? Remember, this is 1985. This is not the digital world we live in now. What matters is not what Canadians think is right for themselves to see. What matters is what Canadians would not abide other Canadians seeing. You are your brother's keeper. Hard to really accept that in the digital world that we live in. But I call it the Mrs. Smith principle. When I was doing a lot of work for newsrooms, there was, and this was in the 80s, there was a very consistently themed phone call that would come into the newsroom and be left on the answering machines. Very frequently. And it would go something like this. I watched your story on X, and I saw right through it for the desperately right-wing fascistic, left/left-wing communistic tripe that it was. And I totally got it. And I totally see how incredibly dishonest, wrong-headed, and mistaken you are. But I'm really worried about Mrs. Smith down the street. She is so stupid that she's going to think that what you're telling her is true. And that's terrible. And you're horrible, and I'll never watch your station again. That was a very, very common, and it crossed all the political spectrums and all of the issues. And it was the same phone call each time. I get it. I'm smart. My neighbor down the street is incompetent, is inadequate, and I got to look out for her. What matters is what Canadians would not abide other Canadians see. The point here very quickly is that that is non-dialectical. That is not communicating about an issue. It's the inverse. Censorship is not debating the issue, is not defining where, trying to understand in a conscious way where the line is. And if you accept my Steven Pinker argument, that degree of non-dialecticism, if that's a word, impedes our progress as a society. And I'll just leave you with a bold question, and you'll recognize the simplicity of the video game art, a book about censorship of great literature and art, and Aaron Schwartz. In this day and age, is all speech and creativity political? I kind of think it is. So now we come, got to some footnotes, but we come to the, what about the gun issue? And there's lots of ink spilled around virtual versus real guns. And in all of it, haven't quite seen this point made. And right or wrong, to me, there's a very big difference between real and virtual guns. And it makes what the NRA says really hard for me to accept, understand, or legitimize as fair as I might try and be. And that is, even if we accept that guns are not the cause of violence, and even if we want to accept a rough equivalency in the debate, that guns are not the cause of violence, video games are not the cause of violence. I mean, it's interesting what they're arguing. They're arguing is guns aren't the cause of violence, but video games is the cause of violence. That seems very hard to do. But stepping beyond that, if you even want to accept that, guns are actually a part of the violence. Video games may be influences, but they're not actually part of, physically and actually and really part of the violence. And that's got to be a huge distinction. And that's what makes guns, real guns, different from virtual guns. It's the difference between actions and influences. And real guns in tragedies are part of the action, not part of the influence. And there's a buffer between action and influence, and that's interpretation. So you may play a violent video game, but you also have the facility, and again I go back to Pinker, to reason, to absorb the information, and to process it. And a lot of that has to do with education and dialectic.
So I'm curious, and this is, I guess, to bring a counter-argument into it, how would you reconcile something like that with, I mean, I think of straight out of Psych 101, what they called the Bobo doll studies, is they had kids into two separate groups. One group would watch violent television or cartoons, one would watch non-violent television or cartoons, and they would put them in the room with one of those big blow-up dolls, the clowns that sort of goes back and forth. And the kids that had been exposed to something violent on TV had actually acted out more aggression than the kids that hadn't. I mean, even though you could see it as the influence and the action being distinct, there was still some link that they were showing in the story.
I don't doubt the influence, and I mean, I have physically felt it, not so much in video games as in coming out of a movie. And, you know, it definitely affects your physical system. But you have the ability to, you know, the distinction I'm making is not, I'm saying the tool isn't the issue. There's a difference between, you know, if they started hitting each other, not hitting the Bobo doll, but hitting each other with the Bobo doll, that gets closer, but it's still not there. It's still not the actually part of the action. It's an influence on the action. So if there's a ton of guns around, I'm even arguing that you can see physical, real guns as influencers, but when you actually kill someone with it, it becomes not an influence. It becomes a physical part, and there's a really big distinction because the last time I checked, and this point has been made in the press, no one has killed somebody else with a video game disc.
Well, I think it's kind of an artificial distinction you're trying to make, with due respect.
No, that's fair. That's
you know,
fine.
you're making a distinction between gun violence and all the other kinds of violence that are kind of minimized in video games, like the Rockstar game with the hot coffee. Like, that's violence against women, and there's kind of a failure to appreciate the consequences when you're in a video game and you kill 10,000 people in half an hour. You don't appreciate, or maybe not even, maybe you just, you know, hit people or whatever, but like, you know, there's not just gun violence, there's like a zillion other types of violence that are fostered in video game imagery.
So number one, fair point. Number two, I think I'm going to prove it's a fair point because I'm actually going to get to that point. I'm trying to give you a very narrowly tailored argument that goes only to the distinction between virtual and real. I am not suggesting that there doesn't need to be a debate on the maturity factor and the thoughtfulness. And I'm trying to place that debate in a dialectical context. I mean, that's what I'm really, and I'm saying that in that debate, we will continue to make progress.
Well, I was also about to say your argument, the one that you're advancing here, is premised on the fact that people are rational human beings and we're able to have this debate and draw the distinctions. And unfortunately, I think at that, you know, earlier on in this lecture, you're saying that almost half of video games are sold to children, and children don't have the luxury of having those kinds of mediating voices. They haven't developed them yet,
No.
you know, and so that also kind of undercuts this argument a little bit, I think.
2 slides away, I promise.
Okay. Sorry.
No, not at all. Tyler.
I feel like the distinction is artificial as well. It would be like distinguishing between the gun and the instruction booklet that comes with the gun. Nobody kills anybody with an instruction booklet. But it's not the gun going off by accident that's so violent. It's that these people going and doing these things are tactical about it. They're
Yes.
learning from video games,
Well,
like an instruction booklet.
are they? And that's the issue. The issue, and you know, hopefully we'll have more science. I don't feel they are learning from video games. I believe that those who are violent are self-selecting to video games, and lots of people who are not violent play video games as well. And so how, you know, so if you're going to deal, again, this is the issue about making decisions and making laws based on the extremes and to try and prevent the extremes.
self-selecting or not, I'm a better assassin now than I would have been if I never played these games.
Yeah. And you're also likelier to be a better surgeon. I mean, there's a ton of studies out there, so you have to balance all of these factors, because there's a ton of studies that show that if you're going to a surgeon, you better hope that your surgeon is playing video games. So, this starts to address Helen's issue a little bit, but again, it's in my dialectical context. And one thing that's happened in the last year, I'm not going to send anybody to the Hitman 3 video, and you're all going to go to it, but the original preview video is beyond comprehension on so many levels. But it led to a lot of discussion. It led to a lot of dialectical debate. And what is really coming out is that a lot of the excesses in gaming, now we've moved away from real guns, a lot of the storytelling excesses are resulting in just bad games and bad storytelling. And there's a reaction to that. And as the gaming community broadens because of iOS and portable devices and kind of more gamey games, and people making a lot of money off of those gamey games, we're starting to see some self-correction within the industry as opposed to censorship. And I leave you with the article from Kotaku. Now, more directly, there's some additional sources here. And the last source is a reasoned discussion that is not beyond this debate and this dialectic as to whether, well, why are we taking chances with kids? And why should kids be exposed to violent video games? That needs to be part of this debate. And that's the difference, if I can try and summarize it, between the US Supreme Court approach, which is more of a First Amendment absolutist position, and the Canadian Supreme Court approach, which leaves room for reasoned decision-making without proof of causality. So there's room to play on this side of the border, and we're going to talk a lot more about Schwarzenegger the week after next, so this is not the last crack at this. But there's some good sources there, especially if you're doing papers. And I don't want to give short shrift to this at all, but I did want to leave you with some sources. These are the best. There's a lot of stuff out here. This is kind of the best contemporary stuff, and these reflect my judgments dealing with issues of women in gaming. I really want to recommend the New York Times article in Virtual Play, Sex Harassment is All Too Real, because it really does focus on a lot of very real, very factual situations. There's the Hitman absolution thing. Interesting, the first two articles about aestheticizing sexual violence and a feminist reviews Tomb Raider, Lara Croft, they both deal with the same game. The second one is after the game is out, and the first one was based on fears of what the game was. And I just always want to recommend Kimberly Voll, who's my colleague at the Center for Digital Media, who day before yesterday wrote a piece essentially about the role of women in gaming and computer science, and that has gone viral and gone ballistic on the web, and she, hundreds and hundreds of comments, and well worth reading. And there's also some studies in there that are important. This goes to the earlier issue. We're dealing with all sorts of strange chemicals here, and when you actually look at the studies, there's negative. And we focused on the negative in terms of violence, but in terms of other effects and educational effects, training effects, reflexes that will be useful in all sorts of things, there's lots of, there seems to be a lot more positive in terms of gaming, putting the violence issue aside, in terms of education and other issues, and other training issues. The game addiction stuff, I've put up some sources for you if you're interested from a paper perspective. The debate, the current debate, is there such a thing as game addiction? So it's the same sort of debate that's happening in psychological terms around sexual addiction. And it ends up being a clinical debate among experts who define in a very legalistic way, in a way we're all very familiar with, what's an addiction. So the debate isn't whether people get hooked on games. The debate ends up being about whether it meets the technical definition of addiction. So I put it out there if you are interested, and next class is about regulation and about privacy, which are two different issues, but I'm going to do my best to really interconnect them. And now we have a special guest.